Bonjour tout le monde.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm accompanied today by the Deputy Prime Minister Freeland and Ministers Joly and Anand. We're here today to talk about the situation in Ukraine. The unjustifiable attack by Russia of Ukraine is unacceptable.
Ukrainians woke up to the brutal, terrifying reality of war. President Putin has launched a horrific, unprovoked attack on their country, a sovereign nation, including missile strikes in their capital, Kiev. He has needlessly put the lives of innocent people at risk, violated Russia's international treaties, and launched the greatest threat to European stability since World War II. Canada is unequivocal in our condemnation of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on the sovereign, democratic state of Ukraine. President Putin's brazen disregard for international law, democracy, and human life are a massive threat to security and peace around the world. I just spoke a few minutes ago with President Zelensky. I told him that we are announcing strong action today and continue to stand with him and with the Ukrainian people. Earlier this morning, I met with G7 partners to coordinate our response. We're also working closely with NATO and our allies. Together, we have made clear that Russian violence, aggression, and violation of international law will not go unpunished. We stand united and steadfast in our support of Ukraine's sovereignty, and we stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people's right to decide their own future in a free and democratic state. Mardi.
On Tuesday, after President Putin's recognition of the so-called independent states of Donetsk and Luhansk, Canada announced an initial series of concerted sanctions. Canada's sanctions target those responsible for illegal actions in Russia, as well as 2 Russian banks supported by the state. Moreover, we've prohibited Canadians from buying Russian sovereign debt. It will be forbidden to participate in any financial transaction with the so-called independent states of Donetsk and Luhansk. We also announced the deployment of up to 460 additional Canadian Forces troops to support Operation Reassurance under NATO and to favor peace and security in Europe.
Reckless and dangerous military strike, we're imposing further severe sanctions. These sanctions will target 58 individuals and entities, including members of the Russian elite and their family members, as well as the Wagner Group and major Russian banks, among others. We will also sanction members of the Russian Security Council, including the Defense Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Justice Minister. In addition, effective immediately, we are ceasing all export permits for Russia and canceling existing permits. These sanctions are wide-reaching. They will impose severe costs on complicit Russian elites, and they will limit President Putin's ability to continue funding this unjustified invasion.
Today, in light of Russia's reckless and dangerous military strike, we are imposing further severe sanctions. These sanctions are wide-reaching. They will bring about major sanctions for members of the Russian elite and will prevent President Putin from financing this unjustified attack. I want to be clear. Russia's attack against Ukraine is also an attack against democracy, international law, and freedom.
Russia's attack on Ukraine is also an attack on democracy, on international law, on human rights, and on freedom. Russia's actions stand in direct opposition to the democratic principles that generations of Canadians have fought to protect. Democracies and democratic leaders everywhere must come together to defend these principles and stand firmly against authoritarianism. Russia must immediately cease all hostile actions against Ukraine and withdraw all military and proxy forces from the country. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected, and the Ukrainian people, like all people, must be free to determine their own future. I want to be clear. Our quarrel is not with the people of Russia. It is with President Putin and Russian leadership that has enabled and supported this further invasion of Ukraine. La vérité.
The truth is that Russia has been violating Ukraine's sovereignty for years. In 2014, it illegally annexed Crimea. Since then, it has never stopped harming democracy in Ukraine. And today, President Putin opened a new dark chapter of this story by launching a wide-ranging invasion.
Disturbing times for the international community and for people everywhere who care about freedom and democracy. And while the eyes of the world are on leaders, we can never lose sight of the human cost of conflict. Innocent people, including children, are now facing violence and chaos. In these dark hours, Canada's message to the people of Ukraine is this: you are not alone. We are standing with you. For Canadians and permanent residents in Ukraine, your safety and security are now our top priority. We also want to make sure that you can get to safety. We've arranged for safe passage for you and your families at the land borders with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. We are urgently issuing travel documents for affected Canadians, permanent residents, and their immediate family members. We're also prioritizing immigration applications for Ukrainians who want to come to Canada. And to ensure we can serve people as quickly as possible, today we are launching a new dedicated phone line for anyone at home or abroad with urgent Ukraine-related immigration questions.
To Canadians and permanent residents in Ukraine, your safety and security are our top priority. We also want to make sure that you can get to safety. We have arranged for safe passage for you and your families at the land borders of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. We are urgently issuing travel documents for affected Canadians, permanent residents, and their immediate family members. We are also prioritizing immigration applications for Ukrainians who want to come to Canada. And to ensure that we can serve people as quickly as possible, today we are launching a new dedicated phone line for anyone at home or abroad with urgent Ukraine-related immigration questions.
I spoke with Ukrainian Canadians at the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress board meeting. I told them that President Putin has underestimated the strength and unity of democratic allies and partners, and he has underestimated the strength and resolve of Ukrainian people. These are traits of Ukrainian Canadians, too. You have helped build this country. You are proud of your culture and your heritage, and you don't back down. Well, neither will Canada. Our support for Ukraine, for democracy, and for human rights remains unwavering. Merci beaucoup. Je passe maintenant la...
Thank you very much. I'll now give the floor to Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland.
Merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you, Prime Minister, and good afternoon. When we woke up this morning, the world was different. Russia launched a brutal and unprovoked attack against Ukraine, a country with a population of over 40 million people which only wants peace and freedom.
We woke up to a changed world. Russia has launched a brutal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, a country of more than 40 million people who have sought nothing but peace and freedom. The horrific human costs of this cruel invasion are the direct and personal responsibility of Vladimir Putin, who has chosen to invade a sovereign democracy and challenge the rules-based international order. History will judge President Putin as harshly as the world condemns him today. Today, he cements his place in the ranks of the reviled European dictators who caused such carnage in the 20th century. The response by Canada and our allies will be swift, and it will bite. This barbaric attack cannot and will not be allowed to succeed. To my own Ukrainian-Canadian community, let me say this. Now is the time for us to be strong as we support our friends and family in Ukraine. Now is the time for us to remember «Ще не вмерла Україна». И моим друзьям в России я хочу сказать прямо и четко. Наша ссора не с российским народом, а с президентом Путиным и с теми, кто его окружают и поддерживает. С теми, кто сделал кровавый выбор атаковать суверенную демократическую страну. Canada understands what is at stake. We know that the people of Ukraine, in fighting for their lives, for their sovereignty, are fighting for us too. They are fighting for democracy, and we stand with them. Thank you very much, et je passe maintenant la parole.
I'll now give the floor to my colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly.
Today is a dark day. Last night, Russia launched an unjustified attack on Ukraine. Over the past several months, we have said that Russia was positioning troops and equipment to invade Ukraine. Russia said that it was not, that there was nothing to worry about. Russia lied. We said that Russian military buildups along the border were continuing to grow. Russia said exercises were complete and it was withdrawing troops. This was a complete fabrication. Russia told us their military exercises in Belarus would end on the 20th of February. Today, Russian forces are invading Ukraine from the territory of Belarus. We said that Russia would fabricate a pretext for military intervention in Ukraine. And Russia has tried to do that repeatedly, although in no way convincingly. Russia argued that the Minsk agreements were to be the only roadmap to peace. This week, Vladimir Putin declared the Minsk process dead. For Russia, this was never any question of a diplomatic, for Russia, there was never any question of a diplomatic solution or an honest conversation about security in Europe. That this was always about Russia taking control over Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia is solely responsible for this crisis. They have chosen deception, intimidation, and a manufactured crisis based on lies and false flag operations. Today, the Russian regime is challenging the world order that has kept us safe since the Second World War. Au cours des derniers mois, nous avons
In the past few months, we have said that Russia was placing troops and equipment to invade Ukraine. Russia said that we had nothing to worry about. That wasn't the case. They lied. We said that the military buildup along the Ukrainian border continued to grow. Russia said it was going to withdraw its troops. That was pure fiction. Russia told us that its military operations in Belarus would end in late February. Today, they're invading Ukraine via Belarus. They said that the Minsk agreements were the only roadmap to peace. But today, President Putin said that the Minsk agreement was dead. So Russia has proven the real nature of the Putin regime. They are solely responsible for this crisis that they created through disinformation, manipulation, and bad faith.
I have been in touch with the Office of President Zelensky, with the Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. I have been in touch with many of my G7 counterparts and the Secretary General of NATO. We're united. Canada stands with Ukraine and its people. Alongside our allies and partners, we will ensure Russia's actions do not go unpunished. You have heard the Prime Minister. We will impose a strong package of new sanctions targeting all major banks, oligarchs, member of the National Council, including Minister of Defense Shoigu, Minister of Finance Sylvanov, and Minister of Justice Trichenko. Canada will also block exports to Russia that require permits. Existing permits will be cancelled and all applications will be denied. No aerospace, technology, and mineral goods will be sent to Russia. Canada has one of the strongest package of sanctions being released today. And together with those from our allies, we're inflicting severe pain on the Russian regime and the Russian economy. We call on Russia to stop its attack immediately and to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy. This madness has to stop. Comme vous l'avez entendu de la part
As you heard the Prime Minister say, we are imposing new sanctions against large Russian banks, oligarchs, who are part of the close inner circle of President Putin, the Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Justice. Canada will also block all exports to Russia that require permits. Existing permits will be cancelled, and all applications will be refused. Nothing regarding aerospace technology or minerals can be exported to Russia. Canada has put in place one of the most vigorous series of sanctions possible, and our goal is to weaken the Russian regime and its economy.
Spoke again this morning to Canada's ambassador to Ukraine. Our staff are now safely in Poland. As soon as we're able to ensure adequate delivery of services, they will return to Ukraine. Consular services remain available to Canadians in Ukraine. Information on how to reach Global Affairs can be found on our website and on my social media channels. Should there be a surge in demand for consular assistance, we are ready. Our teams in Ottawa, Warsaw, and major European cities are on standby to support. The safety and security of all Canadians is our highest priority. Canadians in Ukraine should shelter in place unless they are able to leave the country safely. I'd like to finish by expressing that I know that the pain we're inflicting on Russia does not compare to that being felt by the Ukrainian people today. You can be assured that Canada and the world is with you.
I'd like to conclude by saying that the sanctions imposed on Russia are not comparable to what is felt by Ukrainians today. Rest assured that Canada and the rest of the world is with you today. Thank you.
Or to my colleague Anita Anand.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everyone.
Devastating day for the Ukrainian people, for democratic societies, and for all those who stand for peace and security. Indeed, some in the West have taken peace and security for granted before today. Some may have believed that what is happening right now in Ukraine, in Europe, could not, would not take place. But it is. Putin has chosen to deliberately invade Ukraine, a sovereign, democratic nation that did nothing to warrant this aggression. I am sure many of us could not even imagine what it must have felt like being woken up by explosions. Aujourd'hui,
Today is a devastating day for the Ukrainian people, for democratic societies, and for all those who stand for peace and security. Putin has chosen to deliberately invade Ukraine, a sovereign democratic nation, who did nothing to warrant this aggression.
Ukraine last month, I met with countless hardworking and good people, and I am heartbroken now to know that those same people are fighting for their futures, for their very right to exist as a sovereign people. And to my Ukrainian counterpart, my friend, Minister Resnikov, whom I saw only a few days ago and with whom I am in daily touch, and to all Canadians I say, I am with you, we are with you, Canada is with you. I offer my condolences to the families of the Ukrainians who have been brutally killed, and I wish a speedy recovery to the injured. My thoughts are also with the 1.3 million Ukrainian Canadians watching these unfolding events in horror. Let's be clear. Putin is responsible for these needless deaths, for violating the UN Charter, and for violating the international rules-based order at the same time. And comme Melanie a déjà,
As Melanie already stated,
Putin has tried to convince the world that the path that he has chosen is reasonable and legitimate, mais ce n'est pas le cas.
that is not the case, not at all.
Are not only illegal, they're unconscionable. He has flagrantly disregarded the fundamental rights of Ukrainians to peace, freedom, and self-determination. Since 2014, in fact, Russia has set the stage for this unprovoked invasion, indeed further invasion of Ukraine, for this unwarranted attack on a sovereign people, for this deliberate undermining of the rules-based international order. And there are no arguments that Putin can put forward that could legitimize the choices that he has made. We will not stand for this attack on the rules-based international order. Notre détermination à
Our determination to have international order based on rules and support the security of Ukraine, of Europe, and the world will never be.
Since the very beginning, when Crimea was invaded in 2014, Canada has been there with Ukraine and all those under threat from Russia's actions. I want to outline 5 points. First, we've been there with strong and coordinated economic sanctions, which will continue to weaken Russia. Second, by putting in place then expanding Operation Unifier. Under this mission, our Canadian Armed Forces have trained more than 35,000 of their Ukrainian counterparts to help them defend themselves against an eventuality like this one. We have watched Ukraine's soldiers become a more disciplined, more agile, and more effective fighting force. And as soon as conditions allow, we will continue to provide training and capacity building to the Ukrainian military under Operation Unifier. We have also been providing support from a cyber perspective and will continue to do so. Third, by providing significant financial contributions to strengthen Ukraine's institutions and economy, approximately $700 million in total. Fourth, by providing nearly $10 million worth of lethal and non-lethal equipment, which has arrived in full and in time to be effective and useful. Fifth, and finally, by announcing this week the expansion of Operation Reassurance to bolster NATO's eastern flank and to make it clear to Putin that we stand with our allies and our partners in the face of Russian aggression and destabilization efforts. We have also placed 3,400 military personnel across all branches of the service on standby to deploy to the NATO response force should they be required. We have constantly demonstrated, in short, our support for our allies and our partners in the face of authoritarianism and such aggression. I want to personally thank our Canadian Armed Forces for the critical work that they have done to prepare our Ukrainian friends for this fight. In the coming days, months, and years, your country will continue to ask more of you. Given the increasingly dangerous world, just made significantly more dangerous, your service is more important than ever. And I will do everything in my power to ensure that you are resourced to fight and win. And I can confirm that Canadian Armed Forces are ready to assist with the whole of government efforts in the region. Finally, I will remain in close contact with our NATO allies, our Ukrainian partners, and with Minister Resnikov. We cannot allow Putin to redraw maps and to rewrite history to suit his own purposes. We must and we will stand up against these efforts to sow discord, deceit, and violence. Nous ne pouvons pas permettre.
We cannot allow Putin to redraw maps and rewrite history to suit his own purposes. At this pivotal time for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world, Canada and our NATO allies are more united, more resolved, and stronger than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Anand. We will be taking 20 minutes of questions, starting with the room. One question, one follow-up, then we'll go to the phone. On va prendre 20 minutes de questions, en commençant avec les journalistes dans la salle. Et on va aller au téléphone. Une question, une sous-question, en commençant avec the Canadian Press.
Prime Minister Laura Osman with the Canadian Press. Given everything you and your ministers have just said, is the West at war, and is Canada prepared to fight in it?
We condemn unequivocally this attack on Ukraine, this invasion of Ukraine, but also the violation of the UN Charter, the principles, the rule of law internationally, and we will respond forcefully to make sure that Russia fails, that Russia does not benefit from having invaded Ukraine. We've demonstrated, not just with Canada's response and sanctions, but with the unity that we've seen amongst G7, amongst NATO leaders, amongst EU leaders, and indeed amongst leaders from around the world, that what Russia is doing is terrible and wrong and will be met firmly and forcefully with a response that will punish Russia and make sure they understand that this was a grave misunderstanding of the rules-based order and a grave miscalculation by Vladimir Putin.
And perhaps for Minister Freeland, I'd just love to ask you, is this the end of the post-World War II order as we know it? And certainly the Ukrainian ambassador believes so. And what does that mean for Canada moving forward?
Thank you for the question. It's a really important one. And the reason that we are so determined today, the reason you heard such determination from the Prime Minister and my ministerial colleagues today, is we cannot allow this to be the end of the post-World War II rules-based order. It could be. This is an extremely serious challenge to that order. And if Russia succeeds, then that order will be breached. And we can't let that happen. We can't let that happen because that would be devastating for the world. And it would be really bad for Canada. Canada was one of the countries that built the rules-based international order after the Second World War. Canadians fought and died to build that order. And they did that because they cared about the world, but they also did it because they understood that as a middle power, as a democracy, we really need those rules to be firmly in place. So yes, it is a moment of grave danger. And that's why when all of us said today that the people of Ukraine are fighting for their own democracy and their own sovereignty, but they're fighting for all of us. And that's why we need to support them.
Next question.
Yasmine Mehdi avec Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada. 2 days ago, you announced first wave of sanctions. That did not stop Vladimir Putin. Do we really think that more sanctions will change anything, or are we faced an irrational actor before which sanctions will change absolutely nothing? We saw to what extent it's important for Putin to justify himself by using lies and propaganda for his actions when it comes to communicating with the Russian population. For the past few weeks, or even the past few years, he's been controlling the media. He uses a lot of propaganda tools to convince Russians of some justification, a false one, for his actions, for the threat, the so-called threat represented by Ukraine. Russia, even if it's an autocracy and not a democracy, Putin needs to explain that it's in the interest of his population to take action in an unjustified and unjustifiable way against Ukraine. And the sanctions, not just the sanctions, but the unity that we're demonstrating right now when faced with his actions, if it's the G7, NATO, Europe, or all the countries of the world that are condemning this action, which happened in Ukraine, but could have happened anywhere else, will make it extremely expensive for the Russian economy, for the state, for its leaders, but also for all those who support them. We know that this will really hurt people who are going to ask for better explanations, better answers from Putin, who cannot offer any because this is completely unjustified and unjustifiable. He invaded a sovereign country. I understand, but that doesn't really answer the question, will this change anything? You said he's a dictator, he's acting in bad faith, he's a liar. Will sanctions change anything? Is there a context in which we might go further by sending the Canadian Army to fight next to the Ukrainians? We know full well that this will have an impact on Russia. These sanctions, not just by Canada, but by European countries, the United States, Great Britain, and other allies worldwide, who are coming together to state very clearly, we're not accepting this. We do not accept that Vladimir Putin is choosing to completely disregard the rules that kept us safe and stable worldwide for 75 years. It's not just an attack against the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It's an attack against democratic principles that we had established firmly, the UN rules, and this endangers us all. That's why the entire world is reacting firmly to make sure that Putin fails in his attempt to draw some advantage for his own personal glory or for Russia. Next question.
CBC. Can you provide more detail in terms of the sanctions you're bringing in today? The ones that targeted at individuals, are you freezing assets? Are you seizing assets? And on the export permits, what's that worth? And if I could put a third part in, the Premier of Alberta is talking about a global ban on Russian oil and gas imports. What would you think about that?
These are all conversations that we've been having throughout the past weeks amongst our allies. We know that Russia is a significant source of natural gas and oil for European partners. And one of the things that we've been doing over the past number of weeks is ensuring that there are alternatives to Russia, not just to make sure that our friends and allies in Europe continue to be able to function their economies and support their people, but to make sure that Putin no longer draws sustenance for his economy from selling those products around the world. In regards to sanctions, any individual country can only have so much of an impact, particularly Canada, that doesn't have huge trade with Russia, to be honest. Since Crimea in 2014, we have significantly decreased our interactions with Russia. But the cumulative impact of the unity in the West in standing strong on these sanctions is going to be significant. And to further speak about these sanctions, I'll turn to Minister Joly.
Thank you. So in response to your question regarding permits, we're canceling all already issued permits and pending permits. Hundreds of permits are now being canceled, and it is worth more than $700 million. It includes companies in the aerospace sector. It includes companies that are in the technology IT sector. It includes also technologies that are in the minerals sector. These companies need to have permits to send their goods to Russia. And so that's why this is how we as a government can really have a strong impact. If I may go back to your question that you asked about the impact of the international rule-based order, I think that Canada, the world needed Canada after the Second World War, and the Deputy Prime Minister explained it very well. I think that now the world needs even more Canada, because it is important that we reach out, yes, to the G7, yes, to countries within the NATO alliance, but also countries that are preoccupied with their own sovereignty and territorial integrity across South America, across Africa, across the Gulf, and across Asia. And that's what we'll be doing in the coming days. Thank you.
Next question.
Prime Minister, I asked you a version of this earlier this week about the effectiveness of sanctions. And it seems to me that sanctions are designed to get a response from a rational actor. And I'm wondering if you think Vladimir Putin at this time is a rational actor.
I think Vladimir Putin has come to believe that he can lie with impunity, that he can violate international law with impunity, and that he can do whatever he wants in the interests of the Russian state. And what we are demonstrating with this strong, united response is that is simply not true. That democracies can and will push back against autocracies. That we will demonstrate that we can follow up to defend the values and the principles that we, and indeed people around the world, hold dear. The freedom, respect for the rule of law, of human rights. And sanctions work. We've seen it, our ambassador to the United Nations brought up the example of sanctions against apartheid South Africa in the 80s that ended up bringing about an end to that regime and that approach. Yes, we will continue to demonstrate that those who violate the rules-based international order don't get to benefit from the trade, the opportunities, the economic growth that comes with a stable, clear, international, rules-based order.
Prochaine question.
Of course, Christian.
I'd just like to add one thing about the impact of these targeted sanctions and about Russia. I think it is so important as we see the Kremlin order this truly barbaric act to be very clear that our fight, our opposition, our fierce criticism is not of the Russian people. And in fact, Russia has such an amazing, rich intellectual tradition, such an amazing intelligentsia. And there have already been Russian intellectuals, Russian journalists, Russian writers speaking out and saying how terrible, how vile this action is. That takes real courage. And we have to hear those voices too. One of my Russian friends, a Russian economist who actually worked in the government under Yeltsin, but also under Putin, sent me an email this morning saying now he knows how it felt to be a good German in 1939. And there are people in Russia who feel that way. And it's important for us to see them too. And when it comes to the sanctions, Melanie and her colleagues have done a very good job at targeting the people who have been Putin's fellow travelers, people who have been able to become extremely rich, enjoy all of the pleasures of the West, of Western democracies, while aiding and abetting Vladimir Putin. And what these united sanctions from the West are saying to those people, to the Russian oligarchs, is you're not going to be able to keep on doing that. You are not going to be able to be a high roller, enjoying all of the fantastic things which Western democracy has created, and continue to support this evil, barbaric policy. And I believe that that will have a real impact.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau. TVA. President Putin indicated that anyone who interferes in this operation will be exposed to an immediate response by Russia and consequences that you cannot imagine. Do you fear this? Does this mean that you will avoid a more muscular military response? We've already responded militarily with arms that are currently in the hands of the Ukrainian army to defend themselves against this Russian invasion. When it comes to the threats from Russia, from Vladimir Putin, we remain solidary with the leaders of the G7, of Europe, of NATO countries, and we will unequivocally maintain that solidarity, not just with Ukraine, but with the principles of the rule of law that protect us all on an international level. This is a profound violation of rules that have maintained peace for over 75 years. And it is our duty to stand up firmly to demonstrate that Vladimir Putin will not profit from this invasion of a sovereign country. Next question.
Snatchkate, CTV National News. Would you be willing to fast-track Ukrainians to Canada
And how soon and how many Ukrainians? And will you try to avoid a similar incident with what we saw in Afghanistan with people trying to flee to Canada there and many were unable to get here?
We have worked over the past many weeks to prepare exactly for such eventualities. And as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, we are facilitating the crossing of Canadians and permanent residents into neighboring countries. We are emitting rapid travel documentation for those who need it. We're providing support for Canadians in Ukraine. We are there to accelerate visa applications and extensions for Ukrainians in Canada right now. We are going to use all those tools to make sure that Canada continues to be a good friend to the Ukrainian people, even as they suffer through this horrific and unjustified attack.
Next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Mercedes Stevenson, Global News. I'm wondering why you haven't chosen to sanction Vladimir Putin directly. Muammar Gaddafi did suffer that fate, and you're talking about making Mr. Putin feel the consequences of his actions, but you haven't chosen to target him directly. Why is that? And is it because you're concerned about the threats he has made on anyone who will do that and the possible implications for Canadian security and the Canadian economy?
The key thing on sanctions has been to come forward in a coordinated way with all our allies, and that is the unity that is most damaging to the Kremlin and to Vladimir Putin, that we are all unequivocal and united on this. But for further comments on sanctions, I'll turn to Minister Joly.
Thank you, Mr. Rees. Today is a first important package of sanctions. There will be other sanctions coming. And that's important for the Canadian public to understand, because we want to make sure to put maximum pressure on Vladimir Putin's regime and also on the Russian economy. To do that, we need to do the work with our allies. We will continue to work with them, and we will really make sure that we're coordinated in locksteps. It is important for us to act as one. We don't want to create any form of loopholes. We want to make sure that our unity continues to be our strength. Thank you. Donc, aujourd'hui,
So today, this is a first package of significant sanctions, one of the largest of any of our allies, but it's only a start. There'll be other sanctions. Every time we announce other sanctions, we will do that in a coordinated way with our allies. The objective is to be united. Why? Because we must make sure that there's no way for those who are in Putin's close circle, who are the sphere of influence, that's exercised on the population of Russia. We want to make sure that there's no loophole for those people. Under the circumstances, we will work with our G7 allies and the NATO allies and any other allies. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. The first question will be from Justin Ling, freelance. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. In the last 12 hours, we've seen a considerable amount of success from the Ukrainians in shooting down Russian aircraft. They've done that thanks largely to surface-to-air missiles given to them by their Baltic allies. They've been requesting this sort of equipment from the West, from Canada specifically. Are we considering purchasing any kind of Stinger or Manpad missiles that could be given to the Ukrainian army?
Thank you, Justin. As you know, we have successfully delivered 2 shipments of lethal aid on top of military equipment that we sent a number of weeks ago. We continue to look at more and further ways to support the Ukrainian military in their brave stand against the Russian invaders. We continue to exchange with allies and coordinate to make sure that we're getting the Ukrainian military the tools that they need. But on further elements on that, I'm happy to turn to Minister Anand.
When I was in Ukraine, in Kyiv, a few weeks ago, I sat down with Minister Resnikov, and we had at least an hour and a half conversation about this very topic. We spoke in detail about the types of aid that Ukraine needed and the types of aid that Canada had in inventory to provide. And what we have done is to provide almost $10 million in lethal and non-lethal aid at the current time. Your question, of course, is what, in addition, can we do as a country? And I want to assure you and Canadians that our government is examining all options to consider further aid to Ukraine. It would be imprudent to describe those options at the current time, but as soon as we have more to tell, we will do so. Thank you.
Following up.
Yeah, clearly we're continuing to follow these ramping up of sanctions. I'm wondering if you can preview what other sort of diplomatic or economic or even cultural pressures Canada can exert. Obviously, there's conversations about recalling ambassadors. Some European countries have moved to take Russian propaganda outlet RT off the air. And there are conversations about how to identify and potentially freeze and seize the assets of oligarchs who support Mr. Putin's regime. Can you give some detail about what that could look like in the coming days and weeks in Canada?
Well, these actually are all elements that we discussed this morning amongst G7 leaders and indeed have been the topic of conversation between our ministers and their counterparts and allies around the world for many, many days now. We are announcing today a extremely strong, unprecedented series of sanctions because of Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine. But as was pointed out, we will continue to look for more and further ways to work in a coordinated, concerted fashion, and not just European countries and NATO members like Canada and the United States, but other partners around the world who are also expressing very real concern that if Vladimir Putin succeeds and benefits from this illegal and unjustifiable invasion of a neighboring country, then all are at risk. And we have undone the incredibly hard work of generations to establish a set of rules in our international order that have benefited us all and allowed for unprecedented peace and stability around the world, despite the very many challenges we face.
Thank you. Operator, we'll take one last question on the phone.
Thank you. Merci. Et la prochaine question va être de Mélanie Marquis, La Presse.
Mélanie Marquis, La Presse, you have the floor. Thank you. My question is for Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to get back to the very first question that was asked. Is Canada at war? Your minister, Ms. Anand, said the troops were ready, that they had the support of the government. What would give the signal that we have to send troops on the ground? Ukraine is not a NATO member, but would it take a UN resolution? Would Canada support military intervention? No, those are very good questions, Mélanie, because everyone is wondering that. The reality is that the best way for us to demonstrate to Vladimir Putin that he's made a grave error by violating the rules-based order that have been governing the world for decades is by ensuring that he cannot profit, that he can't benefit from this monumental error that he's committed by invading a sovereign country. So, yes, we are there to support them with weapons and military aid and economic aid. We also there to support and reinforce our NATO partners to demonstrate that we are an alliance that will respond and will defend itself if there is an attack against one of our members. But at the same time, we are demonstrating that democracies that defend the international rule of law will not hesitate to respond in a firm way, in a very real way, to anyone like Putin who violates the principles that have kept us safe for decades. Follow up? My follow-up would be for Ms. Joly. You met with the Russian ambassador earlier today. Could you give us an overview of that meeting and tell us whether you're considering his expulsion as ambassador or calling back the ambassador to Russia in Moscow? Yes, I had an opportunity to speak to our ambassador in Moscow earlier today and to get information about the state of affairs in Moscow, in Russia right now. Of course, it's important to have access to that information, and we're in contact with her, but I'm also in contact with my colleagues, the ministers in the G7, so that we can have a coordinated response from a diplomatic standpoint. And I met the Russian ambassador. I explained to him very firmly, looking at him eye to eye, what the government of Canada's position was about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So the message was understood very well, and we'll continue to monitor the situation. You have to understand, of course, that the trust between Canada and Russia has been broken now. I think my colleague, Ms. Annan, had something to add to your question. I'll give her the floor.
Bonjour, Mélanie.
Hello, Mélanie. With regard to our missions, I want to be clear. These are training missions to unify. That's for unifier, and reassurance is a deterrent mission. These are not combat missions. And as the NATO Secretary General said this morning, we don't have a combat mission right now. That has to be clear for our country and for our Canadian Armed Forces as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. That puts an end.
Thank you all.